Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name's Hannah White, and I'm the director of the IFG, and it's a fantastic opportunity to welcome you all here today to the IFG, and those of you who've come in person, and welcome to everyone who is joining us online. We're holding this event to mark the 15th anniversary of the creation of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in 2010, and we are delighted to welcome Sir Nick Clegg to reflect on that moment and the moments that followed, and to give his reflections on what government today can learn from the experience of the coalition. Sir Nick was, of course, Deputy Prime Minister between 2010 and 2015, and the Liberal Democrat MP for Sheffield Hallam between 2005 and 2017. And since he left government, he's been over the other side of the Atlantic working for Meta, which he has now left. Nick's going to speak, and then I'm going to ask him some questions from here, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the floor. If you're watching online, please do send in your questions via Slido, and they will make their way seamlessly onto my iPad. So over to you, Nick.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you all for being here. I think it's the first time I've delivered a speech on anything to do with British politics in over a decade, so bear with me. It might not be quite as polished as I once aspired to be, and I've got about 25 minutes worth of pontification here, so please sit in your seats with rapt attention, and then I think we'll do some Q&A, and then we're all free to go until the 25th anniversary, and we'll be able to assemble then. But it's really great to be here, and thank you, Hannah, and to your team for arranging it. So, the central facts about the coalition government formed 15 years ago this month were that it was a coalition, the first in almost 100 years, and of course that it was born at a time of economic and political turmoil. The 2010 election was defined by the fiscal crisis that followed the great financial crash of 2008 and the crisis of legitimacy that followed the MP's expenses scandal. And together, they created a political landscape that was ripe for change and a government that was uniquely assembled to deliver it. And it's hard, standing here today, just to recall how fraught that feverish spring really was, how fragile Europe's economies felt, how uncertain we were that the UK could escape the spiralling sovereign debt crisis engulfing Europe, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the first run on a British bank in centuries, the RBS bailout. In a nation bruised by recession and soaring unemployment, the spectre of further economic hardship loomed over everything. And then, in the space of just a few days, there were riots in the streets of Athens, a 1,000-point drop in the Dow Jones, a €110 billion bailout package, and an election in Britain which returned no overall majority. The bond markets were circling. Britain was burdened with the largest deficit in peacetime history. So a hung parliament fed the sense of underlying instability. And that was the context in which we entered the negotiations. And throughout the 5 days that it took to sew together the coalition, the sensation that things were perilously close to slipping out of control was ever present. And the peril was real. It's a well-worn trope that the newly elected head of government, flushed with victory, emerges ashen-faced from their first national security briefing. Well, I had a similar experience when a Treasury official coolly explained that the shattered British banking sector's total liabilities were almost 5 times the size of our entire economy. And from that first press conference in the Rose Garden onwards, we strived to project the confidence that we knew people and markets needed to see. Many observers immediately predicted that the coalition would collapse within months. Given the precarious state of the country, the need to show that multi-party government could function and function well was never lost on me, not for a moment. Nor was the knowledge that a sizable proportion of British voters, 1 in 4 of whom had voted for the Liberal Democrats, had entrusted us to deliver change in the way politics and government was done in the country. Even though this is an anniversary event, my hope is that we spend as much time looking forward as we do looking back. I will not avoid the failures as well as the successes of the coalition, which remains one of the most unusual, and I would argue one of the most successful governments over the last couple of decades. But I am sort of temperamentally averse to lengthy retrospection, and it's my view that experience in governing is hard-earned, so it's good to put it to productive use in informing future decisions as much as it is raking over the past. The passage of time, of course, is a gift. It distinguishes the important from the insignificant, which is just as well, since the daily cut and thrust of Westminster often does exactly the reverse, elevating the insignificant over the important. So what then does perspective reveal? Well, the most immediate observation, in my view, is that the coalition was bookended by two momentous shocks: the financial crisis in 2008, which preceded it, and Brexit in 2016, which succeeded it. And what is striking from our current vantage point is that the coalition was a 5-year haven of stability between these seismic events. It's striking, too, how the common assumptions about coalition, that it would be unstable and cautious, turned out to be quite wrong. It was, in fact, more stable than successive single-party governments that followed it, not less. It lasted a full half-decade, considerably longer than the May, Johnson, Truss and Sunak premierships, which followed it in chaotic succession. And it was a highly reformist government across education, the public sector, energy, fiscal policy, constitutional reform and more, from the pupil premium to support children with the greatest needs, to the provision for the first time of universal infant free school meals, from the massive increase in investment in renewables, to the development of a modern industrial policy, from same-sex marriage legislation to the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, from far-reaching pension reforms to an unprecedented lifting of the income tax burden on low earners. The coalition demonstrated something which so many of its critics had discounted: that multi-party government in Britain could produce both political stability and policy reform. Now, that was in part because genuine deliberation was built into the structures we had to create to sustain the coalition. The Quad, where Danny, Alexander and I would thrash out the most contentious policies with David Cameron and George Osborne. It's Danny's birthday just recently, by the way, just thought if I'd put that in there. Hold the front pages. The Quad, where Danny and I would thrash out the most contentious policies, particularly at sort of around budget time with David Cameron and George Osborne, proved to be a really effective decision-making forum. So much so that the Institute of Government, I believe, I understand, is recommending it as a model for other governments to consider. Less visible were the cabinet subcommittees, which provided fora for detailed scrutiny from ministers across the coalition. Discussions in cabinet were, on occasion, shock horror, actually real discussions. And the constant back and forth between David Cameron and myself, from our weekly bilats, as they were called, to the ongoing flow of paperwork, messages and telephone calls, created a forcing function to drive agreement across often stark political and departmental differences. All of this served to strengthen our decision-making, since ideas were constantly challenged, even if they came from the very top. And it gave the lie to the lazy assumption, most often aired from the right, that majoritarian government was necessary for decisive government. And from the left, much of the mythology around the coalition's economic record also proved to be wrong. The inevitable physical adjustment required after the 2008 crisis was not, as alleged, a vicious ideological assault on the size of the state. In fact, by 2015, public spending as a percentage of GDP was higher than it had been on average under the previous Labour governments. And what's more, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling had enshrined into law in early 2010, by way of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, a legal obligation to reduce the deficit by half over 4 years. In the event, much though Labour condemned the fiscal adjustments they would have had to make had they remained in government, the coalition reduced the deficit more slowly than that Brown-Darling plan. In truth, much of the fiscal contraction introduced by the coalition involved slowing the increase of public spending, which had expanded rapidly in the last 18 months of the Brown government, from 40.3% of GDP to 46.4% of GDP. By the spring of 2015, the end of the coalition, public spending as a percentage of GDP stood at 42%, which was very much in line with the long-term trends of the size of the state. Nor, importantly, did this fiscal adjustment, contrary to repeated allegations, lead to lower growth. GDP growth surged to among the highest in the G7 from the end of 2012 right through to 2016. Asserting that there has been no growth since 2010, as ministers are still wont to do, is, in technical jargon, a very big porky pie. The tragedy that the UK went from being the fastest growing economy in 2016 to the slowest in a matter of months thanks to the Brexit vote remains one of the greatest acts of economic self-harm in modern times, and a convenient veil for the critics of the coalition to rewrite history. That we were able to deliver all this, a significant fiscal adjustment, the restoration of growth, a dramatic reduction in the unemployment rate we inherited after the financial crisis, and a continued repair job to the stricken financial system as fairly as possible remains an unusual feat for which the Lib Dems in the coalition deserve a great deal of credit. I remember well how nonplussed the Conservatives were about our insistence that the Treasury publish the full distributional analyses of each budget, a practice which they promptly abandoned after the coalition ended, which showed, for instance, that the top 1% paid more in tax between 2010 and 2015 than they ever had done under the previous 13 years of Labour government. Of course, this does not mean that we fixed everything economically. Productivity remained damaged after 2008, as it still is today, and real terms wages only started to outpace prices towards the very end of the coalition before being knocked back by the Brexit vote. And of course, although it was necessary to tighten fiscal policy at a time when the public deficit was soaring higher and faster than it had since the Second World War, and a sovereign debt crisis was burning through Europe, I'm very aware that the decisions we made in the coalition had real effects on people's lives. We strove to minimise those effects and mitigate their consequences where possible. But the state is an unwieldy thing, and there are, of course, decisions which I regret today. Still, the caricature of the coalition's core economic policy has always obscured more than it has illuminated. I suspect this is one reason why the Labour leadership is having such a hard time leading the party on its core economic policy today. For years, they fed the party faithful the false assertion that fiscal discipline is morally repugnant. Then they made implausible commitments not to raise any major taxes, and now find themselves in a fiscal doom loop chasing speculative OBR projections. It would be easier to have some sympathy with the decisions the Labour government has made in recent months on welfare reform, increasing tuition fees, on local government funding, on departmental spending limits, if they hadn't been so insufferably sanctimonious in condemning similar measures during the coalition. And this is what happens when you appear to have few bedrock principles about the balance of spending and borrowing, and instead flip, almost overnight, from condemning fiscal orthodoxy to becoming its hapless prisoner. But if the coalition delivered stable government and sensible economics, it was clearly bad politics for the Liberal Democrats. For one thing, we fell short on our central mission of political reform. One of the key motivations for the Lib Dems was our view that in order to prise open the closed shop of British politics on everything from party funding and House of Lords reform to fixed-term elections and electoral boundary reform, we had to somehow get one of the other two establishment parties over a barrel. The basic symmetry of the coalition, an agenda for economic reform on the one hand and a serious crack at political and constitutional reform on the other, did not hold. We ended up doing a lot of the former and not nearly as much of the latter. Put simply, I significantly underestimated just how powerful the resistance to change from the Labour-Conservative duopoly and their outriders in the media would be. This inertial drag kept us mired in a series of losing battles against those who benefited from the status quo. We were strung along by the Conservatives in negotiations on party funding reform, They connived with Labour to block elections to the House of Lords, and the alternative vote referendum was a disaster. The Tories were always bound to campaign against it, but what was more surprising was how significant parts of the Labour Party joined them, even though a change to the alternative vote was in Labour's own election manifesto. Ed Miliband, as Labour leader, barely lifted a finger. And so we lost a once-in-a-generation chance to prise open the suffocating grip of first-past-the-post politics. There are people who will say that much of this failure was due to errors on my part and of the Lib Dems in coalition, that if only we'd chosen a different PR system to put on the referendum ballot, everything would have turned out differently. In my view, it wouldn't have made the blindest bit of difference, and in any event wasn't available to us in the pre-coalition talks from Labour or the Conservatives. With hindsight, I suppose it is fair to say that we might have stood a better chance of convincing the country of the need to change the electoral system, a subject of overwhelming indifference to the vast majority of voters, even at the best of times, if the referendum hadn't taken place in the immediate aftermath of the first spending round and the controversy around tuition fees. But then again, I was under remorseless pressure to move forward with the referendum as fast as possible, lest the moment be lost. Such are the realities of practical politics. It's also fair to say I misjudged the downward pull exerted on smaller parties in coalitions, from the D66 in the Netherlands to the Free Democrats in Germany and many more, especially progressive parties in government with erstwhile opponents on the centre-right. For many supporters, it turns out the initial sense of betrayal and disorientation of coalition outweighs any material or policy benefits. It is notable that the largest decline in Lib Dem support came immediately after the coalition was formed, an even more dramatic drop than in the wake of specific policy controversies like tuition fees. Perhaps the somewhat dispiriting realisation is that people often say they want politicians to work together, but the moment they do, you find there is a heavy price to pay. Compromise is quickly branded betrayal. This pattern seems to be near universal. The leader of the Free Democrats told me last year he could endlessly repeat lists of policy achievements he secured in the last coalition government in Germany. But the sense of anger that they were in bed with the Greens, a party for which they had particular contempt, was just too much for his party supporters to bear. And when the leader of the Democratic Alliance in South Africa asked me whether he should go into coalition with the ANC, I told him he should definitely do it for the sake of his country, but he shouldn't necessarily expect to get thanked for it. And that remains the reason I would have done it all again. It was right for the country. I believe that political capital should be used, not hoarded. And so did my party, which voted overwhelmingly in favour of entering into coalition. That made the loss of seats and standing we experienced in the aftermath even more painful. Large numbers of councillors and MPs lost their seats and their associated livelihoods, having demonstrated considerable fortitude in seeing through the collective decision to form the coalition in the first place. But we, did the right thing for Britain at a difficult time. And surely that's the reason you go into politics in the first place. This likely won't be the last time the party faces such a choice. The Lib Dems are in rude health once again under the leadership of Ed Davey, beating Conservatives across their heartlands. And one day, they will again need to decide whether political capital should be used in government or nurtured in opposition. Politics without power is like a car without fuel. So it's my enduring hope that they will opt for the former, notwithstanding the short-term partisan risks, even as they learn from the past. Which brings us to the key question. What can be learned from the government of 2010-2015, which is of any relevance today? Now, clearly the circumstances are dramatically different from 2010. Back then, Nelson Mandela, Fidel Castro, Margaret Thatcher were all still with us. Netflix was a company that sent you DVDs by mail, and TikTok did not even exist. It really was a very different time, and it would be foolish to stretch any analogies too tightly over a decade and a half. Yet despite the momentous changes in the interim, Brexit, Trump 1 and 2, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, we find ourselves facing some familiar challenges. A systemic economic shock radiating from the US. Last time it was subprime mortgages, this time it's protectionism, and public hunger for multi-party politics in a system still built for two-party rule. So with that in mind, here are a few observations that might usefully be applied today. The first is that growth doesn't come from edicts in Whitehall. It comes from millions of decisions taken in the private sector every day when entrepreneurs, innovators, and consumers have confidence in the future. That is essentially what the coalition gave the private sector, the confidence to make the many decisions that in aggregate drive growth. It sounds easy enough, yet the evidence since then would suggest it is surprisingly hard. Indeed, a curious feature of the current British political landscape is that the private sector is now not really spoken for. Labour seems to think growth is invented in Whitehall and that stern admonitions to regulators and quangos to deliver growth should do the trick. The Conservatives have forfeited the right to speak for business after the calamity of Brexit and the dysfunctional governments which followed it. Reform are economically all over the place, protectionists in one breath and free marketeers in the other, depending on who they're talking to. And the Liberal Democrats appear a little more comfortable talking about the distribution of wealth rather than the difficult choices about how it can be generated in the first place. I think there is a real opportunity for whichever party can set out a compelling modern economic policy, one that recognises the absolutely central role the private sector plays in shaping the country's destiny and offers both the clarity and the competence that businesses need to plan, hire and invest. As I saw firsthand in the almost 7 years I was in Silicon Valley, there is a tremendous demand for precisely the kind of resources that Britain can mobilise. World-class universities, researchers and entrepreneurs. We're standing at the edge of a quite different economic era, one which will be increasingly shaped by competition over the production and use of artificial intelligence. The combination of skilled workers, a culture of inventiveness and an open economy ought to put Britain in a strong position to prosper in this uncertain future. But we have squandered a great deal of confidence in the UK as a place to do business over the last decade. So the belief in private sector endeavour, which existed at the time of the coalition, is in urgent need of rediscovery. The second point is that it is possible to be both fiscally pragmatic and fiscally credible. In fact, the more credible you are, the more scope you have to cut your cloth as you go along. Like the current Chancellor, the coalition held great store in the fiscal plan we laid out at the outset. Yet the Eurozone crisis rumbled on, and when we were hit by a massive spike in inflation in 2011, 2012, one of those significant macroeconomic events that is entirely forgotten in much commentary today, and growth continued to splutter, the Treasury put great pressure on me to chase our tail, fiscally speaking, and agree to a whopping £13 billion of additional cuts in the next budget to meet George Osborne's original deficit reduction timetable. I refused and said instead we would simply need to take an extra year to reach our goal of halving the deficit, which is what we did. This was politically difficult, not least because securing the country's fiscal position was one of the animating imperatives of the coalition. But being as clear as we had been about the centrality of fiscal policy allowed us to adjust course when growth stalled early on. In other words, far from being dogmatic, we were, because of the internal dynamics of the coalition and the role of the Lib Dems, far more pragmatic and adaptable than our critics ever understood. And this is strikingly different from the current government, who've given up pounds of flesh on the basis of an OBR projection that few think will hold true. The third observation is that storytelling matters enormously for the success of any government. For the first period of the coalition, we embraced a compelling story. Britain had been badly battered by the financial crisis, voters had been let down by the expenses scandal, and so it was time to put country before party. This gave people a simple reason to believe in the programme for government. We were putting political differences aside to fix things that everyone knew needed fixing. But The narrative was worn bare by the passage of time and by the inevitable intrusion of controversies, unpredicted events, and partisan tensions within the coalition. And by the end, I was left parading a list of policy achievements, not telling a story, which left voters cold. Events washed over us, and we ended up badly listing. Labour should pay heed lest they commit a similar error. If you are running a government, you must, above all, have a clear story about where the country has come from, where it is, and where you want it to go. Narrative, a beginning, middle, and end, is the essential motive force of politics, and it becomes even more important in government when there is rather less tolerance for the comforting fictions that opposition parties tell themselves and their supporters. The final observation from my time in government, which is relevant to today, is that Europe remains the perennial question in UK politics. It never goes away. David Cameron and I had thought we had parked our differences on Europe with the 2011 European Union Act, which only allowed for a referendum if the UK was asked to pool new powers in a new EU treaty. But the civil war in the Conservative Party ground on. I refused to reopen the EU Act, refused to agree to a referendum in the absence of a new EU treaty, and Cameron made his infamous Bloomberg speech, committing to a referendum if the Conservatives won the next election. I had privately resolved that if the Conservatives and Lib Dems would have to negotiate another coalition agreement, I would not countenance an EU referendum in the absence of a new EU treaty. A pending veto which perhaps Conservative high command thought they might use as an alibi to get themselves off the hook. In the event, of course, the Lib Dems were decimated in the 2015 election, the block we had placed on a Brexit referendum was removed, and the rest is unfortunate history. Today, the Prime Minister hopes that the question of our long-term European vocation will not raise its ugly head again, replaced instead by the ducking and weaving we've seen over the last few weeks and at yesterday's UK-EU summit, as the government negotiates for trade scraps from the high tables in Washington and then Brussels. Now, whilst no one should begrudge the government's attempts to eke out concessions from the larger economies to our east and west, we should be under no illusion that Britain is now reduced to the negotiating status of a mid-sized state with far less leverage over the Europeans and Americans than at any time in the last 150 years. All this is made worse by the government's needless red lines against the EU's customs union and single market, without which a major resuscitation of the British economy will always prove difficult. Fear of the red wall appears to have produced red lines which just don't make much sense in the real world. For those who believe we can do better, there will again be a moment to choose for Britain. Are we a satellite state of the United States or a leading member of our own continent? The answer for now seems to be that we're trying to be both. But in truth, we will be neither until we decide to be one of them. For generations, we have fancied ourselves a bridge between Europe and America, but a bridge connects to solid ground. A Eurosceptic minority in Britain have spent a generation chipping away at one end, only for nationalists in America to tear up the foundations on the other. And now we risk teetering unmoored in the middle, stranded on a bridge to nowhere. I'm afraid that our current strategic ambiguity is a luxury we will not be able to indulge much longer. It will come as no surprise that my preference would be a full-throated return to a reformed European Union, which will mutate fast in the years ahead in any event, if it is to survive at all, by incorporating Ukraine into its membership, developing hard as well as soft power, and focusing more ruthlessly on the priorities which count in defence, energy and innovation. This will allow us to resume our place as a valuable trading, security and intellectual partner in the project that has delivered 75 years of peace on the continent, and which could now do with our help as much as we could do with theirs. The global financial crisis and Brexit permanently altered the trajectory of the British economy, and consequently a great many lives as well. While they were different in their origins, both served to remind the UK of its true position. One country in a global economy with rather less control over our own destiny than we might hope, and now every bit as exposed to the daily outrages emanating from Washington, D.C., as we are to the European politics over which we have little say. Nor has our political system evolved at all to accommodate the plurality of opinion across British society. In the 2010 general election, the Lib Dems secured their highest vote ever, 24% of the popular vote. Yet we were rewarded with barely 8% of seats in the House of Commons. Today, the Lib Dems, focusing with ruthless efficiency on the parts of the country where they have support, find their vote and seat share more aligned. But the telltale signs of a political system hopelessly unrepresentative of the shifting pluralism of multi-party politics is as glaring as ever, as we saw in the recent local elections. First past the post still distorts and misrepresents the public mood, and in a time of six-party politics seems likely to deliver ever more bizarre and irrational results. I tried and failed to crowbar changes into the stultifying British political system by way of coalition government. Perhaps the ramparts of the Conservative Labour duopoly will be overwhelmed by new insurgents in novel ways, or perhaps it will take another coalition for political reform to finally have its day. Seen chiefly through this lens, the coalition failed to prepare Britain for the world in which we now live. But there is another way of looking at it, which is that in the midst of a reckoning with Britain's place in the world, caught between the grinding forces of history at a time of considerable peril, we managed to assemble a majority for stability that crossed party political lines, showed that there are big things upon which decent-minded opponents can agree, and achieved a great deal of what we hoped: real reforms in education, environment and tax justice, changes to the way the country is governed, all the while steering the country's finances away from the rocks and leaving the economy on a surer footing than we found it. As is always the case, there will be critics from right and left who will continue to hold a very different assessment of the coalition government. Happily, it's no longer my responsibility to try and persuade them otherwise, which leaves me simply free to conclude with this. It really was the privilege of a lifetime to serve as the leader of the Liberal Democrats and the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and to be a leader of the unusual and hugely successful government that was formed 15 years ago. Thank you. Yeah, I know, man. Great to be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Nick. IFG is definitely a place which encourages people to reflect on what works in government, so really interesting to have heard your speech today. Just to remind anyone who's watching online that you can send your questions in through Slido, and I'm sure people in the room will have questions too, but first a few from me. You mentioned the work that we did at the Institute. We are Commission on the Centre of Government, and what we were looking at there was really ways to remedy what we see as a fundamental lack of strategic capacity at the centre of UK government. And we talked to lots of people who told us that, who agreed with you that the coalition's quad was an effective means of both maintaining strategic focus but also driving trade-offs at the centre of government. But I'm interested, there were another set of people who said to us, but that only worked because it was a coalition, that a single party government couldn't sustain that and it wouldn't work in the same way. What's your view on that question?
I think that's probably right. I think if you have a single party government with a single Prime Minister, everything gets organised as it traditionally has in Whitehall, which is highly centralised. It's a pyramid with one person at the top. It doesn't broach much dissent, really, slightly depending on the personalities involved. So I do think it's a dynamic which is in part driven by the fact that you have people... I can't actually... It's suddenly coming back to me. I can't tell you how oddly clarifying it is to sit in a room with people where you start at the beginning knowing that you disagree. So there's no emotional surprise that you disagree. You know you disagree, and you're trying to find agreement. It oddly enough makes it... As long as you're pragmatic, and to be fair to Cameron and Osborne in particular, they were very pragmatic about this too. You're just trying to find that Venn diagram where you might overlap. So you're never sort of hoodwinked or shocked by the fact that you don't agree. And that's why always the most vicious arguments in government between people who ostensibly should agree with each other. If you start from a position of disagreement, it's sort of strangely straightforward. And then you either do or you don't find agreement. And I think that was the dynamic which maybe some of the civil servants you're talking about picked up on. It meant that you just had to thrash stuff out. You had to really ventilate what you're what your preconceptions were. And dare I say it, I certainly found, I'm sure Danny and others who are in the audience, and Tom and others who, and many others, I won't try and call it. Now I can see lots of friendly faces actually. Discovered is it also challenges your own preconceptions, which is always a good thing in life. It clearly is. And so, certainly in the first part of the coalition, I don't know, the first 3 years or so, it was on the whole, I think, a pretty robust, organised, candid way of trying to find agreement from disagreement. I think in the latter stages, this probably actually happens in single-party governments as well. As you're coming towards the finishing line, everybody gets paralysed by, hand-to-mouth media cycles and opinion polls and all, freaking out before you go to the country. So certainly in the latter stages, it will slightly kind of, ground to a halt. But I think for a good chunk of that time, it was surprisingly. I mean, the thing that I got wrong, I kind of thought, well, as long as you're winning those arguments, and you're winning them on the things that you really care about, and you're delivering all the good policies, then the politics will take care of itself. Didn't get that bit quite right. Of course, one of the things I misunderstood was no point being in the bowels of Whitehall, overseeing, as I believe myself and my team did, good governance, good decisions in the way that I described. No one's going to thank you for that if they don't see it. And the part of the problem was that the way that Westminster and Whitehall are both designed and literally architected, including physically, make a coalition party invisible. I mean, you are literally invisible. So either I was mute sitting next to David Cameron, and of course you get yelled at from Guardianistas and activists saying, "Oh my gosh, you're not biffing him in the nose." Well, no, because I'm sitting in the chamber in the House of Commons, but I've just biffed him in the nose, before or after the PMQs. But the visual imagery was hopeless, absolutely hopeless. And by the time I realised that, it was basically too late. And I think if this happens again, I would strongly counsel anyone who does this again to think much more than I did about almost what I call the sort of theatrics of coalition government. So you somehow show the mechanic, and it can't be endless little briefings to journalists. Oh, I disagree with this, and I got this pound of flesh, and that pound of flesh. It's got to be just a more visible thing. And hindsight's a great thing. I think some people say, oh, you're all too chummy in the Rose Garden. Yeah, maybe with hindsight you can say that, but I cannot exaggerate to you how the priority we felt just to show that multi-party government could work. We had to give it a good start. The country really was treating, you just think about it. The liability of the banking system, 5 times the size of the whole British economy. That's like diffusing a vast bomb that could just go off and engulf you completely. So the incentives at that time were all about just showing people it can work. Of course, with the passage of time, you think, oh, it would have been better if you'd done a bit more of a sort of tug-of-war thing. But the long and short of it is, I think Whitehall and Westminster are absolutely not designed for this kind of thing at all. I think Gus O'Donnell and then Jeremy Hayward did a very good, passable job at trying to prepare for and adapt to the coalition government. But that's basically what it was. It was an extremely entrenched system, which you know better than I do, adapting to what they basically thought was a bit of an alien kind of organ, and then resuming normal business the moment we were ejected from office in 2015. I personally think, and this is where I think the IFG can be so helpful, because I think it is so likely that there will be multi-party politics again, I think Whitehall needs to think much, much more deeply about how it serves multi-party poles of power than it has done hitherto.
Yeah, the signs are, as you say, with a sort of fracturing of opposition, that it may well be something that a sort of a system, as you say, built around two-party rule is no longer necessarily fit for, and as you say, is something that the IFG and my colleague Akash, who's sitting in the audience here, has done some work on already. You spoke about austerity. We do a lot of work also on public services, and we have found that some of the key measures that the coalition used to cut public service spending, so holding down public sector pay, making wide-ranging redundancies of experienced staff, cutting in capital investment, shifting spending from preventative services to active ones. All those had a long-term damaging effect on the productivity of public services. Is that one of the things, when you talk about decisions you might have made differently, you reflect on?
Yeah, for sure. So, for instance, capital. It was clearly, with hindsight, we shouldn't have cut capital investment. I mean, Danny can speak to this better than I can, or Tim. I see Tim Loynig and other Giles are in there. But we cut capital spending too deeply at the beginning of I think we tried to reverse it towards the end. That was clearly a macroeconomic mistake. And there were many measures. Whether I thought the reform of Chris Grayling's reforms on the probation system was just completely potty with hindsight, and completely bonkers. Lansley's ludicrous thing of the NHS stuff. But I mean, I have to say, certainly in my position, which you thought literally every day is, which battles do I fight? Which battles do I fight? Which things am I actually trying to secure? And of course, in a coalition, you don't win all the battles. But for sure, I think there were definitely, with hindsight, some of those things. Capital investment, certainly, I remember. I think we recognised it, but we shouldn't have cut capital spending the way that we did at the beginning.
One last one for me, and then I'll come to the audience. The IFG really believes in investing in the skills and understanding of government that politicians need to be effective ministers, and indeed effective in opposition as well. And back in 2018, you did an interview for us for our Ministers Reflect archive, which we have built up of talking to people who've left ministerial roles and to get their immediate reflections on that experience. But I wonder, given your experience since in the private sector and so on, and having observed our politics, as I say, whether you agree with us that we should be investing more in supporting politicians to be good at understanding and running government, as well as the politics.
I mean, undoubtedly. I mean, was it Tony Blair who said the problem with politics is you start inexperienced and popular, and you end up unpopular and experienced. It's just the curse of politics. I mean, I wish I knew so many of the things I do now. When I first went, I was a young man when I went into, I suppose, I'm not that old, 58, but anyway, feels a smidgen older. No, that's undoubtedly the case. And look, and also I think if you look at how politics has become increasingly populated by people who've done nothing else. There's far too many people who come out of university, they work as a researcher, maybe work for some, I don't know, lobby company or something, and then they become a candidate, they don't win, and then they win again. These are people who've got absolutely no experience of anything else whenever I'm asked by people, say, what would you recommend, young people who say they want to go into politics, I almost say to all of them, do something do something else first. Build up some independent experience. If you can, build up a little bit of money in the bank account so you don't cling on to office when you get there because it's the only thing you can do. I really, I think there's a real danger of the political class becoming a political caste, which is just circulating the same people. And I don't know, I'm sure you can tell me whether this is right or not. I do get the impression that has become more and more the case, and that we're just not getting the diversity of people from different backgrounds into politics. So I do think it's tremendously important for institutions like the IFG in that context to be around to try and kind of get people to raise their sights, ask themselves questions they will have never asked before. And what other walk of life? Do you just get thrown into an office and say, right, run the country? It's like no preparation. I mean, I was literally in an office where I didn't think I had a phone. I didn't have anything. It's like literally, what am I supposed to do next? It was just thinking back on it, it's crazy. It's just so little thought is given to actually trying to prepare the people who have to take highly consequential decisions about whether you send, our brave forces into action, or whether you reduce this or that, or increase this or that public expenditure, which taxes you chop and change. I think this sort of glorious amateurishness, which we love as Brits, I honestly think we've tested it to destruction, and it's time to professionalise things a bit.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, my colleague Lauren has a roving microphone. We'll take questions one at a time, and please could you tell us who you are and where you're from? That would be very helpful. Can we start over here in the corner?
Thank you. Kieran Stacey from The Guardian, representing the Guardianistas.
Don't take it personally, Kieran.
You knew I was going to when you said it. Just a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned your views on the Lib Dems' current economic policies, which you said you think are focused a little bit too much on redistribution and not enough on growth. Can you go into any more detail about that? What kind of policies would you like to see the party take up which they're not currently doing, or which policies would you like to drop that they're currently espousing? And can I ask you your views on a different former job that you held? What do you make of the direction that Meta has taken since you left, particularly on independent fact-checking?
So on the latter, this is all after I announced my departure from the company, and I don't work there, so I can't give you a great forensic. On the latter, it's not actually Meta, just Meta. It's the whole of Silicon Valley has moved away from, in the US that is, not here or elsewhere, has moved away from using sort of professional, hand-picked, paid fact-checkers to sort of scour the internet for things that are partly true or partly false and so on and so forth. And they're trying to move towards a kind of Wikipedia-style, crowdsource-based approach to that, which in theory, honestly, in theory, if you can make it work, if you can run it at scale, is not a bad idea at all. It's all in that it'll all be, the proof will be in the sort of eating of the pudding, and I honestly don't know where they've got to now. I think they're only doing it in the US, but it's not a mad idea, because you know a small number of people sitting in their apartments trying to kind of scour the internet for stuff that may be, as I say, wholly false, partly false, a little bit misleading, and so on and so forth. You can only ever skim a tiny amount of the content that's out there. So having a kind of thing where you have people participating, which I think was pioneered by pre-Musk Twitter, it's not a bad idea, but honestly, they'll have to sort of prove that they can make that work. On the form, no, look, I'm not going to go through I actually, for what it's, I hate to say that, I don't actually know all the Lib Dem policies off by heart at the moment. No, I don't mean that facetiously, I just don't, of course I don't. It's not actually an individual policy thing. I'm not directing at the Lib Dems. I think they do great work, particularly with small and medium-sized businesses. I think their advocacy, Ed Davis, I thought great on the radio this morning, making the case for the government to go further and embrace the EU customs union. I think that'd be very, very good for business. I think it's more a kind of mentality. You know, in politics, there's only so many hours in the day. Politics is all about what you choose to emphasize and what you don't. You can't do everything. And at the moment, there's just no party who just gets up and says, I am going to choose every day to obsess about how to get private sector growth amongst both large and small companies really going in the country. You've got to project, you've got to talk about it constantly, you've got to worry about it constantly, you've got to just be an absolute remorseless sort of metronome on it. And I just don't think that exists, and I find that weird, given it's the private sector which employs the vast majority of people in this country and generates the wealth that we all want for our good public service. I just find it so odd. The Conservatives, of course, used to be effortlessly the party of business. I think they're now just considered a joke among serious business people after Truss and after Brexit and so on and so forth. So I think there's a huge opportunity, is my own view. And I think it's not about individual policies. I think it's more about, are you putting that up in lights as the thing that you care about more than anything else?
Okay, we're going to stick to one question now per person. Lady there.
Hi, I'm Amy Gibbons from The Telegraph. Given you want the Lib Dems to consider another coalition in future, I'm wondering if you think Ed Davey should stop ruling out a pact and perhaps even think again about how he talks about Donald Trump if he really wants to get into that position of power. And just on that, obviously he did very well at the last election.
That's one question, thank you.
Okay, just a follow-up, but I'll leave it.
I'm struggling to understand why what Ed says on Donald Trump is an issue.
I think I was trying to do two questions.
With him at a senior level in future, for example, as Deputy Prime Minister, if he's been...
No. I think Ed's doing a fantastic job, and I'm absolutely not going to start. I never have since the day I stood down as leader. I've never, ever provided a running sort of commentary as an ex-leader. I'm not going to do so now. I think he's doing a fantastic job. And look at the way he has resuscitated the Lib Dems with 72 MPs now. It really is an incredibly admirable record. And I think he is focused, it seems to me, quite rightly, on making the party a meaningful presence in Parliament. That was his overriding priority, and he's done that. It's a great achievement. So no, I agree with everything that my leader says.
Should he still be ruling out a pact if you think they should consider...
A pact?
In terms of
in terms of getting into Parliament when
Look, honestly, I think all this endless stuff, well, what did you say before? It's like, let the people decide, and then the politicians will have to react to that. It's kind of like, it's pretty simple. The politicians, if the people don't give any party a knockout majority, parties, which is what I had to do when I was leader of the Liberal Democrats, will have to work out what they do. Do they ask the voters to have another go? Or do they try and do something novel? It's kind of, I think, and particularly now, I would strongly counsel against endless speculation of the outcome, because honestly, it is now a roulette table, this combination of six-party politics, put through the sausage machine of the first past the post system. I mean, you're seeing this, actually, something I was WhatsApping with Ed about just earlier today. You're seeing extraordinary results at local level, with people winning council seats on like 18, 19, 20% of the vote. We're in 6-seat competitions. We've never had this before. It's just going to spit out all sorts of weird things. So to ask the politicians to be soothsayers, to try and predict what they might do in such an unpredictable set of circumstances seems to me to be a fool's game.
Come to Akash, yeah.
Thanks. Akash Band for Institute for Government. Nice to see you again, Nick. You may recall I did some work on coalitions back in the day. So maybe you've partly covered this, but I am interested in what you would advise the Liberal Democrats if a similar kind of opportunity arose, and in terms of holding the balance in a hung parliament. And specifically, what I'm interested in is, on reflection, do you think a full coalition, where you did, in the way you described earlier, try to reach agreement on pretty much everything, is the right model, or should more consideration be given to something like a confidence and supply agreement, or maybe something like in Scotland, cooperation agreement, where you have a core programme you agree in, but more space, what I think used to call differentiation, that became a buzzword for a while during the coalition.
Yeah. Look, everyone's going to have different views. At the end, you've got to decide, what do you think politics is about? Is it about serving parties or serving the country? Right? I unambiguously, when I was leader, felt very strongly it was about the latter. It's about the needs of the country at a time, as I described, when the country really was facing some very, very profound difficulties. And in that case, it was clear to me that a stable, and as it turned out, stable and highly effective government was the best thing for the country. And I think, of course, there'll be churlish people on the right and left who will say the coalition was absolutely ghastly and so on. I think most fair-minded people would now accept that the coalition was an extremely effective government. I will always stand by that decision. I think it was the right thing to do for the country. As I said in my speech, I think at the end, the political capital is for something. It's not just to admire, it's for something. You have to, now, does that mean that that's the playbook you put into every set of circumstances in the future? Of course not. I can't predict the future. I'm temperamentally, myself, a little bit sceptical of this sort of half-pregnant idea. We're going to be responsible, but not really responsible. We're going to be able to deny. Temperamentally, I never particularly kind of like that. You either grab it with both hands and you're really trying to drive the vehicle, but sort of saying, well, I've got a little perch in the back seat and I've got a few little things we might... Temperamentally, it's not the way I kind of think, but it's a perfectly respectable approach. And honestly, it's going to be driven by circumstances which are so different to 2010 that I'm not sure if I can give any useful observation. I think in the circumstances of 2010, I think it was totally the right thing to do. It was totally the right thing to do. Not least because we've now seen, we've now seen the Lib Dems, thankfully, spring back to rude health. And look, we see this pattern in lots and lots of parts, particularly of Europe, of smaller parties, particularly on the centre-left, if they go into coalitions with sort of erstwhile opponents from elsewhere on the political spectrum, of just, finding it a pretty bruising experience politically, and then recovering again, in places like Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands. That sort of yo-yo is a almost accepted part of the political landscape. Of course it's not here, because we're not used to coalitions. So I think it was the right thing at that time. I wouldn't have advocated a sort of half-in, half-out kind of approach. Doesn't mean half-in, half-out is not an inappropriate response in other set of circumstances.
Okay, I think Carolyn on the line.
Hello, Nick.
Hey.
Carolyn, former BBC. Just a quick question. You were suggesting that when circumstances change, then politicians should go with it and really look at new situations. So you've got Rachel Reeves, who says she's absolutely sticking to her fiscal rules. Would you say at the moment, ditch those fiscal rules? And if so, what's the answer? Is it borrow, tax, or cut?
I just think the government, it's a bit back to storytelling. They keep telling us that the world has changed utterly. They're right. So they should start behaving as if it has. It's this sort of really weird thing where they keep telling us the world has changed completely, and then they're acting as if nothing has changed. I actually think, we were talking about this earlier, I really think the British public is way ahead of the Westminster Village. The British public intuit very strongly that things have changed very dramatically. You know, Trump is not just a sort of kooky incumbent of the White House for a few years. He represents a fundamental breach and a fundamental departure of the way our country has governed itself and situated itself in the world for 80 years. This is really big bananas. And I just find it so frustrating that they kind of get half the narrative right. And they say, oh, but we're going to do exactly what we said before, as if nothing's changed. Of course you have to explain it. Of course you have to explain it. And that might be painful, it might be difficult. Of course you'll get newspaper columnists, oh, you know, we're never going to believe anything they say before. Actually, most voters get it. They get that the world has changed completely. And to lock yourself into this crazy macroeconomic choice of saying, I'm not going to touch all the main revenue-raising taxes and therefore start inflicting businesses with tax increases instead. Everybody knows that's bonkers. Everybody knows that. So I just, my answer would be to in a sense, go further than it's odd. They've got this huge majority, and yet they, for some reason, don't seem to have the courage of their own convictions, is what I sort of sense from the outside. I actually think it would do the country a lot of benefit economically. I actually think it would do them, I think it would help them politically too, if they just were a bit more unambiguous. I mean, it's like this deal yesterday, the European deal. You know, hailed as being a great triumph by the government and, you know, condemned by all the normal, you know, people still having the same debate of 10 years ago, saying it's a terrible betrayal. It's neither. It's actually a bit of a damp squib. You know, the world has changed, and yet, after months of negotiation, they still can't work out how to allow young people to travel effortlessly across the Channel. I mean, what an underwhelming response for the moment we're in. That's the thing, that's the overwhelming feeling. I think a lot of people feel that, they intuit that. And it actually gives the government much more permission, in my view, to do bigger things than they appear inclined to at the moment.
Richard George Parker.
George Parker from the FT described very eloquently how smaller parties get crushed in coalitions. And I'd see you would do it all over again. Just a direct question. Do you think it would have made is it different for the Liberal Democrats doing a deal with a moderate centre-right government to doing a deal with a moderate centre-left government? And to put it in the real world, would it be easier to do a deal with Keir Starmer? Would it do less damage to the Lib Dems than it did for you to do a deal with David Cameron?
I don't know. I mean, time will tell. If you try, look, for what it's worth, my own view has always been that one of the great problems you have if you're a smaller party going into coalition with a larger party is you lose your identity, right? My own hunch is, counterintuitively, you lose even more of your identity if you go into coalition with a party with which you have a lot of policy agreement, because it just starts becoming completely mushy. And this was, by the way, of course, always the thesis of Roy Jenkins and others. They basically think the difference between the Lib Dems and Labour was an artificial one, and they, you know, should hurry along and, you know, just fall into each other's arms. So I personally, I know there's lots of people, including lots of Lib Dems, oh, you know, it'd be fine if we'd done a deal with them, but not with them. Now, I think that's intellectually not very, it's not, you either believe in genuine pluralism or you don't. And if you believe in genuine pluralism, you don't only just have one combination to the exclusion of others. Secondly, I cleave to a stubborn view that there is a long, proud tradition of British liberalism which stretches right back to the 19th century, which is different. It is different to the more statist approach of life from the Labour Party, and it's different from the Conservatives. And I get there are different opinions in the Liberal Democrats and so on. I've never, ever hidden from anyone. I'm a liberal. I'm a liberal first and foremost, and I feel that's a separate tradition. It's a separate school of thought, which I think should stand, if you like, on its own 2 feet. And thirdly, as I say, well, let's see. I mean, my own hunch is that this issue of retaining your identity might curiously be a lot more difficult if you go into coalition with a sort of party where you feel you've got a bit more ideological affinity than it was. But who knows? I mean, maybe someone's going to try that out.
Okay, we could take one final question over here.
Thank you. Hugo Jai from the iPaper. You alluded to the significant dip in your popularity when you went from opposition into government. This has been a bit of a trend ever since. Arguably, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak, and now Keir Starmer have all seen a huge dip from very high approval ratings to very low approval ratings as soon as they sort of get the top job. Why do you think that is? And would you have any advice to Keir Starmer or future politicians on how to stop that happening or how to turn it around?
No. No, of course not. But you're certainly right, Hugo, to observe that, you know, everything just feels so much more febrile. The sheer velocity of politics, of ups and downs, it just seems to accelerate. I mean, look, my reaction, maybe foolhardy, I'm not in politics anymore, so it's an easy thing for me to say from the sort of cheap seats, is if that's the case, when you're in government, go for it. Don't try and sort of, you know, don't try and walk across, what was don't try and hold the Ming vase across the slippery floor. Just go for it. Just do what you think you can in the time you've got, because it's probably going to be shorter than you think. And I personally think one of the things that's slightly paralysing the Labour Party is they're trying to finesse their way to an election which is not going to be held till 2029. It's like, they don't even know what's going to happen next week or next quarter. And they're trying to kind of, you know, I just kind of think if that's the world we're in, and sure, there'll be some groundbreaking, mould-breaking politicians who appear to escape the sort of velocity of up and down. But since I think most won't, I kind of think if you're in that game, just make the best of the time you've got when you're in power. And I certainly like to think that that's what we try to do in the coalition. And if I had to give this speech now and say, we spent 5 years basically worrying and fretting and sitting on our hands and worrying, wouldn't do this, wouldn't do that, but I don't think I dare come here with a dreadful record to look back on. I think we really went for stuff, and we went for some stuff which I remain incredibly proud of. That's probably the lesson I would give to politicians, in as much as anyone wants lessons from people like me.
Well, I think those who have come to listen and those online certainly did want to hear your lessons. So thank you so much for joining us. This will be on our website and YouTube and everywhere very shortly. So please do let all your friends know. They can watch it back. But in the meantime, will you please join me in thanking Sir Nick Clegg?
Thank you.